We're about to begin a discussion examining the art and science behind Donna Davis' exhibition, When a Tree Falls. But before we do, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we meet, the Gimoy, Wallaburra, Yidinji and Yirraganji people, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we've got some incredible speakers spread out geographically across the world tonight, and it's going to be a great conversation. My name's Adam, and I'm facilitating the conversation. I'm an ABC journalist and a radio presenter, and for the last 20 years I've been sharing the stories of regional Australians, interviewing scientists and artists, often about distinctly different topics. So it's going to be fascinating tonight to learn about the connection between the two fields. So we're now going to meet our panellists for the discussion. And sitting next to me, Professor Darren Crane from the Australian Tropical Herbarium, a biodiversity scientist, also a failed engineering student. Darren.
Yep. I realised fairly quickly that wasn't for me. Yeah, so I started as an engineering student, and after a year of total failures, I thought I'd give botany a crack. And many years later, I'm now the director of the Australian Tropical Herbarium based here in Cairns, and the people who I work with and myself do a lot of research into plant biodiversity. So we do work on discovering what species exist and where they occur, how they're distributed, and how they make a living in the environment. And discover a lot of new species along the way, places like northeast Queensland, where there's still a lot of biodiversity that's uncharted.
With us as well today, an ecologist, Dr. Amy Zane, is with George Washington University in the USA. Tell us more about your career, Dr. Amy.
Great. Thanks, Adam. It's great to join. So I'm an ecologist and evolutionary biologist. I mainly have focused on plants, so trying to understand how wood is constructed for plants to live in, say, wet and dry places. But then I started becoming increasingly interested in the plant afterlife. And so thinking about how they're built for life affect how wood decomposes and breaks down. And that's brought me to start working with different decomposers, things like fungi and bacteria, the microbes, as well as termites and solar radiation, sunlight and things like that, and then how that affects what kind of carbon is released from the wood. And so we do a lot of different things looking at plants, looking at these decayers, and looking at carbon fluxes across the world. So it's a really fun, different sorts of projects and brings me into interactions with different people. And so I'm looking forward to telling you a bit more about that today.
Also, part of the discussion today, we have Lisa Chandler, who is an adjunct associate professor of creative industries at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Lisa, tell us more about your work.
Hello. Hi, Adam. I'm an academic, an educator, a writer and a curator, and I've got a particular interest in art that addresses environmental concerns, hence my, connection with this panel. Later in the year, I'm currently co-curating an exhibition which will be shown later in the year at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and it's about artists who've engaged with environmental scientists in extensive ways, and Donna has some work in that show.
Well, that's a perfect segue for Donna Davis. It's your art that we are here to discuss, Donna, and your collaboration with scientists, so please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I also just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and just let you know that I'm actually logging in from Yagara and Yirragapal country tonight. Look, I'm an artist a multidiscipline artist. So I work across a lot of different disciplines, including sculpture, digital media, and installation artworks. And I am really interested in looking at the nexus between art and science. So I often work with scientists in collaboration on a lot of my work, and the projects I work on are often long-term projects. So I'll be working with different teams of scientists, from anything from 12 months up to like the projects we'll be talking about tonight. 4 to 5 years. So I do get to be really embedded in those projects and learn heaps. And so the exhibition that we're talking about tonight, of course, When a Tree Falls exhibition, is a combination of two of the projects that I have been working on. And that is the project with the Australian Tropical Herbarium, the Tropical Mountain Plant Science Project, and the Wood Termite Fungi Project, which is led by Dr. Amy Zane, which is examining, obviously, decomposition cycles in wood, termite and fungi and how they all work together. So I get really excited working with scientists and obviously love creating artworks to visually interpret some of that data that they are capturing and recording.
We might learn a little bit more about the projects on which Donna has drawn inspiration. We'll start with yours, Darren Crane. Tell us a little bit more about the work you were doing at the Australian Tropical Herbarium, for which Donna Davis has been a part of.
So the project Donna's been a artist in residence on is involved with really trying to understand and simultaneously conserve the plants that are found on the tropical mountaintops, particularly in this part of the world. So the project was launched as a response to the realisation that of all the terrestrial landscapes that are to be affected by climate change, the tropical mountaintops are some of those that are more likely to be most severely affected. And the reason for that is that organisms that occur in those cool, wet zones on the tops of mountains aren't able to go anywhere if the climate warms. You know, plants and animals that are living in lower landscapes may be able to migrate south to keep ahead of climate change, but plants and animals that are already at the limits of the terrestrial environment, the tops of the mountains, have nowhere to go. They're trapped. So we simultaneously launched both a rescue mission, if you like, and a science project to learn more about these very poorly known landscapes. I mean, they're hard landscapes to get to. For the most part, there are no roads. And it's a long climb with a lot of stuff on your back. And also because there's a lot of biodiversity up there that is really poorly understood because they're landscapes that people don't visit very often. So we wanted to learn more about the plants that occur there in order to be able to respond in terms of conservation and science measures in an intelligent way. But we simultaneously realised that we can't afford to wait until we have more complete knowledge of how climate change is actually going to affect these things. So we decided to partner with a whole range of really well-run public botanic gardens down the east coast of Australia, some other scientists working on plant physiology and working on seed biology, and launch a mission to capture the biodiversity of these plants that are threatened on these mountaintops into well-managed collections in botanic gardens and in seed banks, as if you like an insurance policy against the worst climate change might throw at them.
And Dr. Amy Zane, tell us a little bit about the project you were conducting and the project you have been doing, of which Donna Davis has been a part.
Great, thank you, Adam. So wood is one of the largest biological stores of carbon. It's why we build furniture out of it and things like that. We build our houses out of it. Researchers tend to ignore how fast wood loses carbon because it's much slower than, say, leaves decomposing or our carbon from soil. And so it's this really overlooked component of the rates of loss of carbon from wood. And so we've been really interested in thinking about, as I mentioned before, that link between how plants are built to live and how that affects their afterlife. And so I talked about the different decayers, who's breaking down the wood, and those are the really critical components. So microbes, fungi, and bacteria are important globally. Everybody knows if you've left your sandwich out in a warm, moist day in the summer or the hot tropics, it's going to start molding pretty quickly. And so we know that microbes, we find them everywhere. In some places in the world, especially the tropics, insects become important. So having termites become a really important part of decomposition in tropical systems. And so this study is really interested in looking at the relative role of termites versus microbes in decomposing wood. And why that matters is that everything respires, everything breathes and releases CO2, but you also have some termites having a methanogenic pathway. So they release methane, which is essentially termite farts. And so methane has a 30-fold worse greenhouse gas than CO2. And so who does the decay and how fast the decay happens can have really important feedbacks with the climate and with global change. And so we're trying to understand those nuances and thinking that termites have maybe relatively more important in wet sites and wet seasons. So we have a rainfall gradient from Cape Tribulation all the way to around just past Mount Carbine. And so we've got a wet-dry gradient. And then we look at their roles in the wet seasons and the dry seasons to better understand how they're decaying, how they're releasing carbon, who's doing the decay, all sorts of things to better understand the system, and then use those data to put into global models of carbon, local to global models of carbon cycling with our collaborators. And
why did you want to have an artist in residence on this project?
Yes, well, so I have funding from the National Science Foundation as well as the UK funding NERC. And with the National Science Foundation's funding in the US, you always have to have broader impacts where it's not just about the science goals, but somehow benefiting society. And as a scientist, you're trying to be creative about how we can benefit society can be a challenge. Often we're doing little or outreach groups to landholders or things like that. And what was exciting about working with Donna is we could we could join a much bigger audience. She has much more outreach than I can, and can do that outreach in really different ways. Because I think scientists often aren't the best people to convey our findings to a broader public. We can practice it, but I think it's fun teaming up with other people who can convey information in other ways. And so I think where Donna and I intersected was in 2018 at a Tanks Art Space in Cairns for her Unseen exhibit. So I was setting up the project, and I went to the Tanks to see a basket weaving project that was there. And I heard around the corner words like microbes, fungi, mycorrhizae, trees. And so I was just slowly drawn over to the space to figure out what was going on. And it was Donna with Sapphire, a mycologist, who were showing Donna's Unseen exhibit. And it was this amazing, all of these different ways that Donna had figured out to try to make seen these hidden players in these plants and their microbial, their fungal players, so that people could actually see what was going on. Everything from these pictures that looked, as you looked different directions, you could see the microbes popping in and out, just soft sculpture, textured, that shows what spores look like, to these little whirling machines that let you see how the microbes change. And so I was just really captivated by that. So we started talking, and it just seemed like I could have so much more of a broader reach with trying to convey our results by working with somebody, an artist, and especially Donna.
And Professor Darren, what attracted you about the prospect of an artist in residence on one of your big field expeditions and your experiments?
To be really blunt, it just sounded like a fun thing to do. I mean, it really did. As scientists, like Amy said, as scientists, we don't normally think about our work in terms of the communication opportunities. Well, at least not with people other than other scientists. Obviously we need to communicate our results, because if results are not communicated, they can't be used. They can't be used to support further research, to understand where we need to do more work. But what we're usually not particularly good at is communicating in simple terms that the broader public can understand. Not just understand, but actually engage with. And that's the important thing. If we're going to be supporting action that we know is needed to fix some of the world's worst problems, then we've got to be carrying the broader public along on the journey with us. We can't be just sitting over to the side and saying, we have the knowledge, why aren't you doing something about it? Because the you won't do something about it unless they're inspired to do so. And it's part of our job to help them along that journey and to bring together all facets of society with a common purpose. We, the scientific community, provide some of the critical information that's necessary to design the actions we need to take. But other people, non-scientific people, need to take up the cudgel and say, well, yeah, we get it. We understand. We understand why this is an issue, and we understand now what we need to do about it, and we're on side. And when I first came across Donna's work, was through a project she was doing with a colleague of mine, and some of that work ended up in the Unseen exhibition. But the work that Donna's doing with our project now is really quite different to that. The work she was doing with Sandra Abel was about the subterranean world of rainforest, which is the world where the fungi and the microbes are working together with the plants and the animals we see above ground to sustain a functioning ecosystem. What we're doing now is something quite different, but how she interpreted those unseen worlds that we as scientists know exist, but she interpreted those in exciting ways that I think really engage with the public, inspired me to give her a call and say, look, hey, how about it? We've got a nice project. What do you think? Is there anything in it for you?
Donna, you might explain your role as an artist in residence on these projects.
Yeah, so I suppose my role, a bit like Darren had said, it's quite a fun role. So I see my role as visually interpreting some of this data that I'm learning while being in the field with these guys, sometimes in the lab, sometimes through reading their papers. But most of the time it's just through conversations, and those conversations are happening, well, since COVID, a lot of conversations are happening via Zoom discussions, things like that. But it's these long-term conversations that I begin to have, and the observations that I take up during these projects that allow me to start to form my own questions in my mind as to what these research projects are all about. And it's through those questions that I then start to ask myself these questions in order to understand these complex issues that these guys are talking about. And I suppose in visually interpreting this data, again, to follow on from what Darren had said, it's really about using it as another tool to talk about the environment. And we know that the science is out there. We know that there's scientific papers. We all know about that, but not everyone will engage in that way. So it's a way to open a door or act as a gateway to the hard science. So it's about creating worlds and interpretations of how different ecosystems work, how different players within those ecosystems work, how we as players within the ecosystems work and operate, and how we can perhaps change some of the ways that we do act and operate within those ecosystems, and why that's important. So I try to explore all of those types of things. Of course, I'm interested in environment, in climate change, in the idea of hierarchies between species. So I'm really looking at it from a philosophical or a psychological standpoint as to how we think as humans within these ecological landscapes. And of course, while I start on these projects, the scientists never really have they never have a specific idea of what they think I'm going to create. They've seen this type of works I've created before. So they pretty much just say, look, you just come up with what you think, and we have these conversations around my ideas. And, we build upon those as we talk about some of the scientific concepts. There's a lot of times where I do pose some of the conceptual ideas for artworks, and then through a discussion, I learn something new about some of the science, and so the concept changes a little bit. So it's this really organically evolving creative process that involves, not only me and my understanding, but the collaborations that are part of that Artist in Residence program. So I hope that explains it.
Lisa, what is your interest in the art science space?
I think it's a bit like Donna. I have an interest in the environment and kind of important issues around the environment, and how art can connect in with that sort of sphere. I like to ask, what can art do? And through that process, I connected with Donna's work. I was a judge of her work in the Sunshine Coast Environmental Art Awards, and which Donna won. And seeing her work, which was quite powerful, quite evocative, made me quite interested in what she was doing. And we subsequently connected, and we've written together about that work in the Unseen project. And now I'm curating her work, as I mentioned before, into an exhibition about artists who've worked with environmental scientists. So it's been a kind of a nice connection that's developed over a period of time.
What kind of examples have you seen of where an artist has really been able to convey, you know, a message or a meaning that might have been difficult for the scientists who had actually done the work to actually have gotten across to people?
I think this whole exhibition is operating in this way, and I guess we'll talk about particular works soon. But I think Darren was talking about it, is when works can engage people with the knowledge, with the research, and connect with people emotionally, that's when works are operating quite powerfully and in engaging people with these important issues.
Well, let's now hear more about the actual exhibition, When a Tree Falls. Donna Davis, you're going to tell us a little bit more about your work, Displaced.
Yeah, so Displaced was one of those works that was one of the first ideas I had, and it was on the very first field trip that we went up to Mount Lewis in April 2019 with the Tropical Mountain Flora Project team. And it was on the journey up there, chatting to the different botanists and ecologists and horticulturalists that were in the team, chatting to them and talking about what we were going to be doing. And we were heading up to the mountain. As Darren had said, we were going to be collecting some plant material and some seed material, and we were looking to collect that material for propagation and for research. And so that was really exciting. And then when we got up to the mountain and we were actually undertaking those roles and actually collecting the plant material, sometimes from really tall trees, there were guys using these really long clippers that were, you know, on these huge, big, 8-metre posts, which, obviously was a skill in itself. But as soon as they got that plant material down, they were documenting, they were labelling, they were pressing some of those specimens to go into herbaria collection, but they were also wrapping up some of those specimens and putting them into eskies. And the conversations around them putting these plant materials into the eskies was the conversation about how long it's going to take before the eskies with the plant material gets to their respective institutions, because they really needed to get that plant material to their greenhouses to propagate as soon as possible. So, of course, in my mind, I'm thinking all about the idea of transplants and how important it is to save these flora species, was to transplant them from the mountaintops down into these new living collections in botanic gardens up and down the East Coast. So the idea of transplant and the eskies started to, talk about this idea of implanting into foreign landscapes. So instead of, being planted into these beautiful mountaintop homes, they're now potentially going to be put in these new environments where they don't know the flora that is around them. They don't know their urban environment. So I suppose I took it one step further and started to think, well, if the plants can't escape, they are trapped up on the mountaintops, they can't go any higher, they can't go any lower because they can't move. What happens, if I start to imagine what sort of potential ecological adaptations might happen? So I visited the Australian National Botanic Gardens to visit how their propagation houses were going. And I did take images of the propagated species. So the little images you can see here, the top half of the flora species is the propagated stock from the Botanic Gardens, and the bottom half is a root system actually taken from my veggie garden when I pull veggies. And I've combined the two and animated the two. And I've decided to put these little plant hybrid creatures into quite dangerous locations as they're traversing the anthropogenic landscape. And the reason they're in these anthropogenic landscapes is really, again, to talk about the role of humans within this system and within this problem. And, whilst there is perhaps a little bit of humour in this work, it's also quite a sombre work because it's actually talking about a real-time rescue mission, and the story behind why these works were created is actually quite a sad story and quite a perhaps urgent story that, we really need to start thinking about our footprint in and on the planet, and how we can change, and what we can do to help save some of these threatened landscapes.
Well, Lisa, this is an area you've done quite a lot of research, curation and writing on, the art science space. How do you feel like this type of work sits within that sphere?
I think it's a really potent work and a very effective work for a number of reasons. And first of all, it's, as has clearly been explained, it's emerged from very deep and genuine research and a collaboration and questioning and discussion that Donna's undertaken. She's done site visits, she's engaged in the research, and so it's got all those underpinnings to the work. But the next thing is that Darren was talking about, research is undertaken, scientists do work, but unless the public engages with that work, change won't happen, or it's difficult for change to happen. So I can just talk about when I first saw the work, it deeply engaged my emotions, and I felt a real empathy for these plants. I wanted to go and give them some soil and water. So it's a work that maybe not for everyone, but for many people will make them care. So it engages emotion. And then another thing it does is engage curiosity. So we're immediately asking questions. Why is this plant displaced? What is it searching for? Where is it going? What's happening to it? And so that dialogue starts off a kind of a search from the viewer's point of view to what is happening, what's this about, and hopefully takes them back to the science and the issues and to changes in their own actions. And then finally, as Donna's been talking about, it's a fantastic work of imagination. And that's something that artists can do. They can imagine futures. They can imagine possibilities. And this, as Donna said, is a kind of, in a way, a bleak future, and but one that's kind of calling to us to take action. So in all those ways and many more, it's a very effective example of an artwork that's really engaging with these concerns.
And Darren, how did you feel when you first saw this work?
Look, I was shocked, but in a really good way, because I think what Donna's done is she's used a visual device which is almost unique. Plants walking, plants doing utterly impossible things, And as a botanist who has worked on plants my entire professional life, seeing a visual representation of a plant walking is like, wow, that's why I'm not an artist. And I was sort of racking my brains about why I found this so arresting and thought-provoking, and I was trying to think of any other cases in my personal experience with literature or the arts of people representing plants walking. And I suppose the two I came up with were Triffids and the Ents from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then I thought, well, those are two, in some ways, heroic figures or representations of plants on the walk. The Ents, saved the day. The Triffids were just, powerful destructive forces, but heroes in their own right. But these poor little creatures that Donna's represented are hapless, bewildered, confused, under threat, running away, creatures of pathos. And that's what I think really engaged me about it, is that not only was it really unusual to represent plants in that way, but I don't know of any other case where they've been represented as walking, objects of pity.
We were talking before about scientists doing the science, but conveying the message isn't necessarily something that comes easily, or certainly getting it out to a bigger audience, a different audience, isn't necessarily easy. How do you think a work like this contributes to the discussion, the broader discussion around the work you're doing, around the impact of a changing climate on an ecosystem that has nowhere else to go?
It just really drives home for me something I really don't think about often enough, and that is that, as Donna points out, and as the artwork conveys, plants can't move. They are vulnerable in ways that animals are not. If the climate warms, animals do a much better job of being able to migrate in response. Plants simply can't do that, or at least not over the sorts of timescales that would enable them to keep track with climate change. I mean, over very long periods of time, plant populations can migrate as the old individuals die up and the new seedlings grow a little bit further away and a little bit further away and a little bit further away, but that's a very slow process that's decades, if not centuries, in the making. Animals can migrate. So plants are singularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change in the way that most other organisms are not. And I think that that the shock of the walking plants in Donna's artwork really does accentuate that singular fact.
We'll talk a little bit now about a work called Decadence, and it was created in response to your research project, Amy, that we were learning about before. What were your thoughts about the work?
Yes, thanks, Adam. What I love about how Donna captures these different critical components about the biological systems is she takes the familiar. So a child fairy tale, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and what was that the one now? With the mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And so we're all very comfortable with that. And she makes it uncomfortable because what she's showing are termites and rotting wood and microbes, these things that are thought to be disgusting. Lots of people don't like them. And she makes them beautiful. And so you're really thinking about what's being conveyed here by taking the familiar and transposing it on the unfamiliar or the things that we think are disgusting. And so, or many people do, I certainly don't. And so I love that ability to push us out of our comfort zone to think of, to then reflect on what's being shown. The other is that I said she's showing, so what we study is how the microbes and the termite decayers, as well as the wood decay itself, changes across a rainfall gradient. And there's so much captured in those images. So each of those mirror frames are the organisms that are being described inside. So the left one with the termites, the middle with the decaying wood, and the right with the microbes. And so if you look at the frames themselves, you'll see that there's a gradient of termites that are the actual termites that move along our gradient, with a high concentration in the savanna and a low concentration of different species in the rainforest. And so she captures that even in these glittery, beautiful mirrors. And so I think there's literally, and as the images are showing, she's showing the turnover across the gradient of the decay, of the decayers. And so very, very beautifully captures the elements of our project, and then makes us question our gut reaction of what is beautiful. And so I love how she's weaved together those different elements.
And did you have one of those moments like Darren where it was kind of not a shock to the system, but a paradigm shift for you as a scientist, seeing your work conveyed in that way?
Well, I think they're beautiful, right? You have to love all your children or whatever, even the ugliest ones. But I think having her represented to a broader audience and showing how beautiful they are, these amazing images that she and then my grad student Becca took of the termites and giving them these amazing colors and textures and things like that, they really come to life and you see the beauty in them. And so I think I find them compelling to begin with, but even more compelling and drawn to them by how Donna has represented them.
And Donna, you do talk about species hierarchies. How does this work actually explore these themes?
Yeah, well, again, some of the really early conversations that I had with Amy when we first met was really talking about ecological players. So this idea of playing in the game of life and the ecological game that we're all a part of were really big parts. And the players, of course, that we're trying to talk about are termites, microbes and fungi again, but potentially considered underdogs or distasteful distasteful to some people. So in my mind, I needed to present them in a really beautiful, a really precious way. So I sort of thought that a really great way to talk about them in that way is representative of showing them in a way that was not only beautiful, but in the stillness. So as you'll see in those animated images, they're very cyclic. So it's sort of referencing the carbon cycle and the turnover of decay. But in the silence, so as the termites sort of swirl out and there comes to a black stillness, the viewer actually gets to see themselves within that frame, see a reflection of themselves. And so that's really asking the viewer to ask them, where do you see yourself within that species hierarchy? Do you think you're better than the termite or better than the microbes and fungi, or do you think you're equal? Or don't you really think about it? So it's really asking the viewer to go, do you have some sort of unconscious bias to species hierarchy? Do you not understand, or do you not know enough about termites and microbes? And even in this exhibition, talking to a couple of people, I was just talking about really simple little things like, there's 12 genus represented in the termite animation, and the number of people who sort of were shocked that there was more than one termite, when in fact, of course, there's over, just in Australia, I think Amy can correct me if I'm wrong, over 300 termites in Australia, and quite a small percentage of those are the ones that actually would want to eat your house. The rest of them are doing amazing things out in the ecosystem, but it's something that probably the majority of the public just don't know. And even microbes, learning about microbes is just such a really fascinating little rabbit hole to dig down into. I'm still trying to get my head around it. So, again, and COVID hit. So then I was struck by everybody's being bombarded with this COVID bacteria image, and I'm trying to represent microbes in a really positive way, which was, really tricky. So the idea of this mirroring and that representation of seeing ourselves within the system, just to remind us that humans are part of the system, we're connected to the system, and everything that happens to the ecological system that is around us, as per climate change, is ultimately going to be happening to us. So we share the same fate as all species. So, when we talk about species hierarchy, should there be a potential shift to a multi-species paradigm where we don't think that we're superior? We need to understand and learn more from our multi-species kin.
Let's learn a little bit more about the creative process and how your team, Amy, who was spread out across the world, actually engaged in this project with Donna.
Great, thanks. It's been interesting. So we have researchers at University of California, Irvine. Steve Allison's there. He studies microbes and is the modeler. And then Paul Eggleton and his group are in the UK at the Natural History Museum of London. He's our termite expert. I'm East Coast US. And then we've got collaborators, Jeff Powell and Will Cornwell in Sydney, and then local collaborators, Alex Cheeseman and Lucas Cernusak in Cairns. We're widely distributed around the globe. And initially, we were a meeting in place. Donna joined us for our first big field harvest in June of 2018, or June of 2019. Sorry, and there we were sampling the wood, and then we were taking sawdust and collecting the microbes and collecting out the termites and putting things into little tubes and jars so that we could then analyze them for enzymes, for the DNA to see which microbes were there, all sorts of things. And so we had a team of 5 of us spread out in the lab, and we were all these little cogs where one person would do something and then pass it to the next person. And so Donna was just moving around amongst us and taking photos and close-ups and seeing what we were doing and trying to put the pieces together, and then asking us questions about, well, what are you doing that for? And sometimes we've forgotten why we were adding this particular liquid to this particular tube, or what, it was really interesting to then step back and explain to her, as she's very biologically savvy, but not in neck deep in the project with us. And so it was really interesting to just step back and look at our project through her eyes. And so that was really an interesting way to bring us together and to interact. We had all these grand plans of her returning for field trips. She was going to go do an artist in residence with Paul at the Natural History Museum of London. And COVID put a kibosh on all of that. But then Donna came back and said, why don't I do virtual residencies? And it's been amazing because she has been able to virtually reach out to all of these people around the globe. And so she's had so many more angles and views into the project than if she'd just gone and visited Paul or things like that. And each time she comes back, she's talking about the pieces that she learned, because it's not just that one scientist, Paul or Steve, but it's the people within their groups. And so she's been roving around the globe, putting these different elements together, talking to undergrads, grad students, postdocs, faculty about the components that come together. And that's really informed the images that she's put together. So these virtual residencies that she proposed have been phenomenal in terms of how I've thought about my work, her work, and how we've worked together.
And what about the benefits you feel these kinds of collaborations bring?
Right. And so I think that what she can do is really put my work that I can get very narrowly focused, as I think Darren was saying too earlier, and she can broaden out the scope and put them in a bigger picture. And really, and in some ways, it sometimes helped me to think of my questions in a bigger light, or what does this mean in a broader context? And so that interplay is really fun. And I think reaching out to broader audiences so that they engage and they think beyond that termites are awful and only breaking down their houses, or fungi are disgusting, or any of these things, a rotting log is terrible, that they start really appreciating these subtleties. I think that's a handshake that I have a hard time doing with the broader public. And Donna's, with her amazingly compelling artwork, is able to help me have that handshake to transfer that knowledge to a broader audience. It's also just interesting to think about how our minds work or what we're displaying. So she would tinker with a piece, send it to us. We'd give her some thoughts, and then she'd comment back, or she'd modify the piece. And so it was this back and forth that was really, really enriching. And so, like, one of the things that I think about is she kept on having these clouds show up in the pictures. And I was like, well, why is a cloud there? And I thought that she was trying to represent the environmental gradient. And it was something to do with weather or precipitation or something like that. And finally, I was just like, why is that there? And she said, oh, well, I took that above in cans above a sugar cane plant. And that was the cloud that was coming off. And for her, those were the gases, because it's really hard. You don't see CO2 and methane, carbon dioxide and methane floating around the air. And so that was how she was representing it. So those are both useful interpretations of what she's done. But it was interesting just thinking about what that evoked in me, and then the dialogue we had. And so I think that was really compelling to think about our systems in different ways.
And Darren, the benefits of collaborations with artists and scientists?
Yeah, sometimes the scrutiny can be really illuminating, like Amy was saying. Most of the time that I've spent with Donna has been in the field, in some rather trying conditions sometimes, in sort of cold, wet mountaintops. And when scientists like me go into the field, we have a job to do. In many ways, it's almost like a military operation. It's expensive to be in the field. It's potentially dangerous, so you have to be fairly disciplined about what you're doing, and have an objective, and have a method to meet that objective. And you tell some bad jokes, and you occasionally swear, and you get dirty and muddy, and you do all sorts of horrible, silly, and embarrassing things. And then there's Donna, standing there at the side of you, going, "Well, what's that? And what does that mean? And what are you doing that for? And, how does that work? And where will this end up?" It kind of changed the mood quite a lot, but in a really positive way, because you don't often think when you're in the field, you're in a sort of military mindset. You've got a job to do. You're working toward the objective. You don't really take time to sit back and think about what you're doing. And to be prompted to do that was a really, really interesting process. Donna, I don't mind saying at the start it sort of felt slightly annoying. It was a bit like having your mum in your ear going, have you got a hanky? Have you got your lunch for school? Sort of stuff. But after 5 minutes, I actually came to really enjoy that, because it really got me thinking about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And, maybe there's a better way. Maybe we're just doing it this way because we always have. And it's a pattern, that's formed, and it's hard to break out of. So thanks, Donna, for being there and for making us think about what we do in ways we probably haven't before and don't do often enough.
And undoubtedly, Donna, there wasn't much swearing going on the field trips, I imagine.
Hey, look, they were all perfectly well behaved. So,
Well, from your perspective, what do you think?
except for the leech story, I'm sure that they all just geared up on their worst leech and tick stories before I even stepped out of the vehicle, just to scare me. Or were they really true? I don't know. I didn't have any bad leech stories to bring home, so I was pretty happy.
Well, yes, we didn't see any leeches represented there in the hierarchy of species. From your perspective, what makes a productive, creative, successful collaboration with scientists?
Yeah, so, this is really interesting. I've been doing this for quite a while, and for me, it's all about relationships. So, I do get to chat to a lot of different researchers and scientists in the general work that I do, and it's like anything. Some people you just hit it off with, and you think, yep, I could really work with that person. And also, then it's about the subject matter that they're researching, unless you've got a real interest in that area that they're researching, it's probably not going to work. So, all of the projects that I do choose to work with are based on, relationships. So that's personal relationship, but also relationship to the subject matter. So I suppose some of the other stuff that you do really need to have is, patience. As Darren just said, you need to be ready to answer a lot of questions and explain them well, but also you need to be able to explain what you're doing because it's just as much about the science, scientists explaining the science, as much as it is about the artists explaining the art, because there really are two disciplines that use quite different languages. And so for me, it's about having partnerships that have equal value on both of those disciplines and can see the value in both of those things. And of course, it's expectations. It's just knowing, what expectations they have on you and what you might have of them. So just being really clear about, what how the collaborative process is going to work, and to make sure that everybody, is on board with how it's going to work out. And like I had said earlier, I've been very lucky working with both of these guys that they pretty much just gave me, open book, like whatever you want to create, you go for it. So, they've been a great lot of teams to work with.
And Lisa, you've worked in this space quite a lot, the two different languages combining art and science. So what do you think makes for a successful collaboration?
I think the notion of time is really important. So again, it's been stressed that these collaborations have gone over quite a long period of time, so that those relationships have been built up, and this mutual respect that's been mentioned, respect for each other's discipline and language, and openness for different perspectives. Often artists can do things in quite eccentric or imaginative ways, but there'll be very kind of specific ways that the researchers will have as well. And when it gets to the sphere of the exhibition, then it's about bringing together those different elements, the art and the science, in a way that engages people. So the art isn't illustrating the work. Can be a space for that, but that's not necessarily in the art gallery. So it's really kind of generating those questions and evoking curiosity. And so then what needs to happen is what Amy and Darren have been doing, is that they're there in the gallery space, they're there in these public programs with Donna, so that the questions that arise can then point back to the science. And my own experience with at the previous exhibition, the Unseen exhibition, or the work that Donna was doing around fungi, really kind of brought an aha moment for me, because I kind of never really thought about the importance of fungi, and then seeing the work, but then kind of reading more through writing with Donna about the subject and about her work, and listening to talks and so on, kind of things gelled. So I think that the exhibition part can be a space where those ideas come together and people really do start to understand. And that's what can make those collaborations so powerful from a public point of view.
We might discuss one final piece of Donna's art now. Donna, tell us more about a work called Would You Love Me More?
Yeah, so this is a work, it was quite early on in the piece. Northside Contemporary Art Space mentioned that they had a lovely big sort of theatre space that they could host a projection work. So I created this work called Would You Love Me More, and it's a large-scale 3-channel projection that features 8 of the endangered and critically endangered flora species from the Mountain Flora Project. And basically, it's showing them in a way that talks about resource use, talks about, again, the idea of preciousness. What would make us love the environment more? Do they have to be beautiful? Do they have to be showy? Do they have to be glittery? So all of these plant species, the actual artwork was made up of I had captured images of all of the pressed specimen collection from the different flora from the project at the Australian Tropical Herbarium Collection. So I'd taken photos of pressed specimens, and then what I did was using those as reference, I digitally created these cloth and gem wrapped flora specimens. So these are all digitally created using gems and velvets and silk fabrics, and then all stitched together to create this animation that sort of grows. And then as you sort of see a wave come through in the middle and ripple out, you start to then see all of the flora disappear. So it's a work that talks about, you know, if we don't value our landscapes and value our environment, you know, we could lose it, and it's suffering right now. So, it is a work that... again, is quite a beautiful visual work, but holds quite a strong concept, especially featuring those endangered and critically endangered flora species. And some of them, I might say too, are quite tiny. Darren could tell you about one of the works featured there is the Hymophilium whitei species, which is a tiny, tiny little filmy fern, and if you didn't know it was there, you would probably overlook it. Yet was originally thought extinct, but found by the project team back in 2017, I think it was. So these beautiful little plant species that people just don't know. And I think sometimes we can run the risk of seeing our environment as just green beauty rather than seeing the individual species that make up that beauty and the interconnected relationships that all those species have, not only with other flora species but with other fungi and microbes and little invertebrates that live in the soil, that we fully don't even understand all of those relationships yet, but they're there for a reason and they're important.
Well, Taryn, you've lived this work, you've experienced this work. How does it speak to you about the very real nature of what Donna has represented there?
Again, it's quite a unique perspective on plants from an artistic point of view. I guess most of the so-called botanical art that we come across is two-dimensional paintings. Still lifes, either flowers in a pot. Or technical drawings of plants, or sometimes, living art like flower arrangements or gardens and things like that. But seeing the science that we do and the plants that we work on represented in an abstract video installation like this, again, was made me do a little bit of a spin. And I think it's wonderful. And I think what Donna's really done is shown that preciousness that she talks about, that we understand as scientists that study these systems. But she's represented in a way that's digestible to the average viewer, and that is to represent it as objects that we normally find precious, velvet, gold leaf, jewels, things that sparkle. And we don't think of the forest, or at least I don't think of the forest as sparkling, but I think of the species themselves as precious, because they're all, every individual species is part of a complex and very poorly understood tapestry. Each one of them is a thread in that network, and the loss of any one of them may have consequences that we cannot possibly predict. We don't know which one of those threads, if lost, pulled, cut, whatever, is going to cause all the tassels to fall off. So they're all precious, and we must assume that they're all precious because we don't know enough about them to be able to say which ones are more precious than others.
Lisa, we might get your interpretation of what Donna has represented there. What did you make of her work?
Look, it's an incredibly beautiful work, which immediately draws us in with that kind of just sumptuous colour, but also the textural elements that she was talking about, things that connect with preciousness in our mind. There's a huge scale to the work that we can't get a sense of here, but that kind of really overwhelming sense in the work. There's a beautiful soundscape to it as well that links back to the sort of rainforest environment. So it's a work that really connects with all our senses. But if you think about the title, it's saying, would you love me more? So as soon as there's a you in there, it's addressing us directly, you. So then we start asking those questions again. Why aren't those plants lovable? What am I doing that I should love them more? And so it starts to bring up those questions of our role in these kind of plants and the future of these plants, and the fact that the plants are there and then gradually disappear gives us this sense of impermanence and change and a preciousness that might not be there anymore. So it's very much a work about looking, but about seeing and sensing and questioning our own kind of relationships to the future of these species.
And Amy, how do you feel about this work?
Yes, I think anthropogenic disturbance, global change is the globe's single biggest threat, and it's acting at local to global scales, right? You have urbanization and loss of species up to these greenhouse gas emissions that are with feedbacks, and so these are critical components to convey to the broader public to understand how in trouble we are. But scientists aren't always listened to, or we don't know how to convey that. So I think what's great with this work and the breadth of Donna's work is that she's highlighting their beauty and also their vulnerability. And I think Darren said that really nicely when we were looking at that displaced plant running around an urban environment. We all have these visceral reactions to these beautiful but vulnerable things. And I think that's drawing on people's empathy and getting them to engage in the image might hopefully helps them start thinking about why these are at risk. And then hopefully then with the knock on then has them trying to think about solutions with all of us. So it's wonderful having Donna as that conduit, using new formats, these digital images that we can see in this virtual space, even though we're not in the same physical space, but it works well in the video. I'm sure it works well in the in-person space too, to convey what scientists are increasingly learning about the climate crisis.
So we've traditionally thought about art and science as being distinctly different disciplines and stemming from different parts of the brain or the nervous system, if you will. But as a final question to all of you, I guess what we've learnt through this process is that there can be collaboration and there can be understanding and different understandings from people having a different perspective on your own work. We'll start with you, Darren. It's an era of increased scepticism around authority and science. We know that, as sad as that is. Do you think there is a role for other forms of meaning, for other parts of communication to try and get the very real and important messages that scientists are learning to cut across to people that they can't currently get to?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is an unequivocal yes. Look, I'm a pragmatist, I think. It's whatever works for me. We should never actually lose sight of the importance of the integrity of the underlying information. That should never be put at risk in whichever medium we choose to communicate those data. But we can be creative in the way that we talk about those results and the way that we engage people in the messages that are encapsulated in those results. And this is where I think these sorts of collaborations with the world's greatest communicators, artists, can really bear fruit for all of us.
And Amy, your perspective, having also been a scientist working with an artist, that different meaning that can be conveyed almost to a different audience, or a different understanding to an audience that would have maybe been open to the science but might understand something on a deeper level through meaning conveyed through art.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think, in some ways, yes, we've always talked about these different, that science and art uses different brains, but in some ways, both of them are really creative processes. For Darren and I to be asking our questions and do our science, we have to think creatively there. And so I think in some ways the journeys I took with Donna are very comfortable in terms of that scope of the scientific process, the creative process, but the outcomes are different. And so I think that a handshake, as I described before, where we can work together to convey our findings was really phenomenal. And being able to reach out to more people. As I said, I had something planned that was sort of pat with my broader impacts for my grant. And I would have reached a small fraction of the globe. And here we have this art exhibit that people are coming to see. They can see it, parts of it online. So I think it helps to highlight the beauty of the natural world and also how at risk it is. And I think I couldn't have done that alone without working closely with Donna. So I think, as Donna said, you have to find the right partners. Fortunately, I found one very quickly in Donna, and I knew from what I heard around the corner that they were the right buzzwords. I think that there's a lot of promise for helping us to get our message into a broader world and maybe more in a more empathetic way, hopefully.
And Darren was suggesting before, he feels like behind every scientist there's a tortured artist maybe hiding in there. Would you agree, Amy?
I'd love to say that. My art, so I knit and things like that. So my art skills are, as we'd say, más o menos. But sure, I appreciate art, at least if I'm not an artist myself.
What are you painting at home, Darren?
I'm not painting. I make music. I'm a terrible painter. I can't draw for nuts. But actually, just to pick up on a point that Amy was saying about similarity in process, I mean, I think Amy's absolutely right. I think there's a lot more that actually unites artists and scientists than divides us. We both are on a search for truth in quite different ways, using quite different methods and quite different approaches. But we also ask why, and we ask how, and we don't stop asking. And I think that's, those two things, the search for truth and the perpetual questions, are two things that, and diligence and attention to detail and all of those things, and just being totally nerdy, about whatever it is that we're doing and we're interested in, totally absorbed by it, are things that artists and scientists have in common, and we should celebrate those and get together and do more of it.
Lisa, your final take on this art and science collaboration and I guess the intersection between the two distinctly different disciplines. Do you feel like there's a lot more ground to cover there, a lot more fruitful collaborations to be had between artists and scientists?
Absolutely, and I would agree with Darren and Amy that there are kind of more connections than people might think, and particularly in that notion of asking questions and being curious and really finding wonder in the things, but expressing it in different ways, and this capacity to sort of bring artists and scientists together. What you'll have with a kind of something like an exhibition of work is perhaps a site where people will engage emotionally with things, will remember particular ideas, will be moved to do something, but it's important, as Darren was saying, that they go back to the science, that they understand the facts and understand the processes. But collaborations such as these are really great ways to bring those different elements together.
Donna, this is an area you've been working in now for some time. You can have the final say. I guess the importance of these collaborations and the value that art can bring to science communication.
Yeah, so I think mirroring everything that everyone has said, and yeah, there definitely is a lot of similarities between the artist and the scientist, and that was hugely made aware, especially during these really intense virtual residencies that I'd been having with Amy's team, where that was in fact one of the questions at the end of residencies. We'd sort of chat about, you know, what did we feel before we went into the collaboration? You know, was there any nervousness about working with an artist or working with a scientist? And of course, when I go to work with any new scientist, I try and, you know, learn as much as I can to try and have the right language, because I'm always worried that they're going to just know so much and I will know so little. And, you know, the truth is that they're often feeling exactly the same way about the art world. So again, it's about that relationship, breaking down any of those barriers and just going, hey, you know what, we are curious. We do, at the end of the day, want the same thing. We want to talk about what's going on in the world, and we want to try and explain it, and we want to try and understand it. And the only way we can do that is continually ask questions and to continually have that conversation. So definitely, again, like Lisa was saying, the idea of having an exhibition is a great opportunity to have, like we've done tonight, a public program that invites both the artists and the scientists to showcase the work, but you know, enables that conversation to develop further, so that the exhibition acts as a gateway to the research. And you just never know, by stimulating something in the visual side of your brain will make you want to go and find out a bit more about the research of climate change, to maybe, I don't know, to maybe help you want to learn more about what's happening, because I think that there may be a slight hesitancy out there around the issue of climate change. It can seem quite hopeless, and it can seem so over-encompassing that, and we're busy. We've all got busy lives and busy families, and we've all got pressures. Is this just another pressure? Is it something that we think is too hard to get into that conversation? So, you know, through my art, I really hope that I've made those conversations a little easier to have, or tread into them a little bit more gently, to have those conversations that need to be had. And certainly, I really believe that art science acts as a huge catalyst for change.
Well, that concludes our discussion, examining the art and science behind the exhibition When a Tree Falls by Donna Davis. So thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to our panellists.